The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle, blanketing cold, but a sharp and brittle thing, a cold that found its way through the tightest chinked logs and turned a man's breath to a cloud of needles before it could fully leave his lips. The land itself seemed to surrender, the prairie grass stiffening into a pale, frozen sea under a sky the color of slate. For the settlers in the small, hopeful cluster of cabins they called Providence, it was the first true test of their resolve, and the cold was a merciless examiner. The cold did not knock before it entered. It crept in through the floorboards, seeped through the mud and moss chinking between the logs, and laid a film of frost on the heads of the iron nails driven into the interior walls. It was a thief in the night and a tyrant by day. Families huddled around their cast-iron stoves, feeding them a constant diet of precious, hard-won timber. The stoves glowed a dull, angry red, but their heat seemed to radiate only a few feet before the cold pounced on it, devouring it whole. The cabins were small islands of flickering warmth in an ocean of absolute zero. They had all built their homes the same way, the way their fathers and grandfathers had built them in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They felled the straightest cottonwoods they could find, notched them with practiced hands, and raised the walls with a speed born of necessity. The roofs were the pride of their work, steeply pitched to shed the heavy snows they knew were coming, covered in hand-split cedar shingles that overlapped in a neat, reassuring pattern. This was the known way, the proven way. It was the architecture of survival, passed down through generations. Yet, this winter was different. It wasn't just the depth of the cold, but its cruel intelligence. It found the weaknesses. The steep pitch of the roofs, designed for snow, did little to insulate. The heat rose, hit the chilled underside of the shingles, and was stolen away by the wind that howled over the peaks like a hungry wolf. In the mornings, the families would wake to find a delicate, beautiful, and terrifying layer of frost on the blankets covering their children. They burned more wood. They stuffed more rags into the cracks around the window frames. They endured. But they were losing the battle. The cold was winning, and the heart of winter had not yet begun to beat. In a small cabin set slightly apart from the others, a woman named Ilara watched the frost form on her own walls and felt the same creeping dread as her neighbors. But her dread was mixed with a different feeling, the ghost of a memory, a flicker of old knowledge that felt as out of place in this land as she did. Ilara was a widow, having lost her husband to a fever on the journey west. She had arrived in Providence with her two small children, Lars and Sophia, and a quiet resilience that the other settlers mistook for frailty. She spoke with a slight accent, a melody from the old country, a place of deep forests and even deeper winters, where survival was not a skill but an art form. She was an outsider, not by choice, but by circumstance. The other women were kind to her in a distant, pitying way. The men, when they spoke to her at all, did so with a gruff and condescending gentleness, as if she were a lost child. They saw a woman alone, vulnerable, and they assumed she was helpless. They did not see the mind that was constantly observing, calculating, and remembering. They did not see the hands that were as capable as any man's, just quieter in their work. One afternoon, as the wind scoured the settlement with pellets of ice, Thomas, the community's most respected builder, stopped by her cabin. He was a large man, confident in his craft and his place in the world. He had overseen the construction of nearly every roof in Providence, and his own cabin was considered the finest example of the craft. He knocked, his knuckles making a sharp, authoritative sound. "The missus sent over some broth," he said, not quite meeting her eyes as he handed her a small, steaming pail. "Your fire is burning high. You'll be out of wood before the new year if you're not careful." It was meant as a kindness, but it was also a judgment. He was telling her that she, like all the others, was fighting a losing war with the tools they all shared. Elara thanked him, her voice soft. "The cold is hungry this year." "It always is," Thomas replied, his gaze drifting up to her roofline. "Your peak seems to be holding, but you must keep an eye on it. This wind can work a shingle loose. Once the moisture gets in, you're done for." She nodded, but her eyes held a distant look. She was not seeing her roof as it was, but as it should be. The image in her mind was of a different shape entirely, a shape from her childhood, from the stories her grandfather told her by a fire that burned with a steady, even heat, not the frantic, desperate heat of the stoves in Providence. It was the memory of a roof that did not fight the winter, but embraced it. The next day, the men of the settlement saw a strange sight. Elara was not chopping more wood for her hungry stove. She was standing beside her cabin, holding a long, sharpened stick and drawing in the frozen dirt. The shape she drew was baffling. It was not the sharp triangle of a proper roof. It was a long, low rectangle with a gently sloping top. It looked less like a house and more like a part of the earth itself. Thomas, walking by with two other men, stopped. He watched for a moment, a frown creasing his brow. "What is this foolishness?" he asked, his voice carrying on the wind. Elara looked up, her face flushed from the cold. She did not seem embarrassed. "I am designing a new roof," she said simply. The men exchanged a look. One of them, a younger man named Caleb, chuckled. "That's not a roof, Elara. That's a lid for a box. The snow will pile up a dozen feet high on that thing. It will crush your cabin flat before January is out." "It is not for the snow," she explained, her voice steady despite their smirking faces. "It is for the cold. The snow will be its blanket." This drew open laughter. Thomas shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Woman, listen to me. We build our roofs steep for a reason, to shed the weight. You invite the weight. You invite your own doom. What you are drawing there is a tomb for you and your children." She did not flinch from his words. She pointed with the stick to a part of her drawing. "The strength is not in the pitch. It is here, in the frame. And the warmth is not in the fire alone. It is here," she said, drawing a thick line over the top, "in the earth that will cover it." "Earth?" Caleb scoffed. "You mean to build a house of mud, like a savage?" "Not mud," she corrected patiently. "Bark, and then sod. Many layers. The birch bark keeps out the water. The sod holds the heat in and keeps the cold out. My grandfather built this way. His house was warm when the winter breath could freeze a man's heart in his chest." Thomas's patience was gone. He saw only a stubborn, foolish woman, clinging to some nonsensical, old-world fantasy. "Your grandfather didn't live in the Dakotas," he said, his voice hard as frozen ground. "We have winds here that can strip a tree bare. We have snows that can bury a house to its chimney. What you're talking about is dangerous nonsense. Build a proper woodshed. Chop more wood. That is how you survive here, not by drawing pictures in the dirt." He turned and walked away, the other men following, still shaking their heads and chuckling. The word spread through the settlement like a winter sickness. The widow Elara had lost her senses to grief and cold. She was going to build a dirt roof. The foolishness of it was a brief, welcome distraction from their own shivering misery. They would watch her fail, and they would feel the grim satisfaction of being right. Elara stood alone, looking at the drawing in the dirt. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she did not move. She heard their laughter echo in her mind, felt the sting of their scorn. But stronger than that was the memory of her grandfather's voice, calm and sure. Stronger still was the image of Sophia's small face, her eyelashes dusted with frost in the morning light. She looked from the drawing to her cabin, then up at the vast, indifferent sky. She picked up the axe that leaned against her wall. The time for drawing was over. The work had to begin. She worked alone. Each morning, before the sun had brought its weak, watery light to the horizon, she was outside. Lars, her son of 10 years, worked beside her. He was small for his age, but possessed his mother's quiet determination. He did not ask questions or complain. He watched her, learned, and did as he was told, his small hands bundled in rags, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Sophia, too young to help, watched from the single window of the cabin, her face a small, pale circle in the gloom. The first task was the frame. Thomas was right about one thing. The weight would be immense. Her design required a lattice of heavy beams, far more than a conventional roof would need. She and Lars ventured into the wooded hollow behind her claim, where the wind was less fierce. They searched not for the tallest trees, but for the strongest, seasoned, deadfall oak and ash, wood that had been hardened by years of standing against the prairie winds. Cutting the wood was a battle. The axe blade rang against the frozen timber with a high, protesting shriek. Each swing sent a shock wave of cold up her arms. It was slow, exhausting labor. While the men of the settlement could fell a healthy cottonwood in an hour, it took Ilara and Lars the better part of a day to section a single, gnarled oak log. They dragged the pieces back to the cabin on a small, crude sled, their bodies aching with a fatigue so deep it settled in their bones. As she worked, she could feel the eyes of the community on her. They saw her struggling with the heavy logs and shook their heads. They saw her measuring and cutting with a meticulous precision that seemed wasteful and slow. Thomas and his crew had raised the roof on the new trading post in 3 days, a flurry of organized, efficient activity. They shouted and laughed as they worked, their hammers echoing in the crisp air. Ilara's work was silent, solitary, and, to their eyes, painfully inefficient. Next came the bark. This was the heart of her grandfather's method, the secret to a dry house. She needed birch bark, great sheets of it, peeled from fallen trees. The living trees she would not touch. She searched the forest floor, digging through snow, looking for the telltale white of the bark. It was a treasure hunt in a frozen world. When she found a suitable log, she used her knife with surgical care, cutting long, vertical strips and peeling them away. The bark was stiff with cold, and she had to work it carefully to keep it from cracking. She carried the precious sheets back and stacked them, the silvery white surfaces gleaming against the dark logs of her cabin. While Ilara gathered her strange materials, the other families prepared for winter in the traditional way. They laid in stores of firewood, stacking it in long, neat rows that grew taller each day. They patched their chinking, mixing mud with dried grass and forcing it into the cracks with a grim persistence. They checked the shingles on their roofs, nailing down any that looked loose. Their work was a frantic race against the deepening cold. They worked with a nervous energy, driven by the fear of the coming storms. They looked at Ilara, moving with her slow, deliberate pace, and they saw a woman who did not understand the urgency of their world. She was not racing the winter. She was preparing a formal welcome for it. Finally, the frame was ready. Using a simple lever and fulcrum system, she and Lars painstakingly hoisted the massive beams into place. Then came the planking, a solid deck of thick-cut boards laid tight against one another. It was over this deck that she laid her first layer of bark. She did not lay it flat. She overlapped each piece like a broad, pale shingle, with the natural upward curl of the bark facing down, creating channels for any moisture to run off. She sealed the seams with pine pitch she had gathered and rendered herself, a sticky, fragrant gum that she heated over a small fire. It was a waterproof membrane, tough and flexible. Then came the sod. This was the most grueling work of all. The ground was frozen solid. She had to use a pickaxe, chipping away at the earth to free squares of prairie sod. The sod was dense, heavy with frozen earth and tangled roots. Each block was a dead weight that had to be lifted onto the roof. She laid the first layer grass side down, so the roots would eventually grow into the planks below, knitting the whole structure together. Over that, she laid a second, thicker layer, this one grass side up. By the time she was finished, the cabin looked transformed. It seemed to have sunk into the earth. The steep, proud peak was gone, replaced by a gentle, living slope that was now a part of the landscape. It was no longer a structure sitting on the land, but a shelter rising from it. The people of Providence had stopped laughing. Their mockery had been replaced by a quiet, bewildered pity. Her cabin was strange, almost alien. It looked primitive, a throwback to a more savage time. Thomas came by one last time, just as she was tamping down the final piece of sod. He did not speak for a long time, just stared at the bizarre structure. "It is done," he said finally. It was not a question. "It is," Ilara replied, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "The first heavy snow will be the end of it," he stated, his voice flat, without the earlier malice. It was, in his mind, a simple statement of fact. "I hope, for the sake of your children, that you have a place to go when it collapses." He turned and left without waiting for a reply. He had delivered his final warning. The consequences were now on her head. That night, the first snows of the deep winter began to fall. Ilara sat inside her cabin, listening not to the wind, but to the silence. The howling gale that had been a constant presence for weeks was now muffled, distant. The thick earthen roof absorbed the sound, creating a profound quiet inside the small space. The fire in the stove seemed to burn differently too. It was a steady, calm flame. She did not need to feed it constantly. The heat it produced lingered in the room, held captive by the immense thermal mass above their heads. Lars and Sophia slept peacefully, their chests rising and falling in the even, gentle warmth. For the first time since arriving in this hard land, Ilara felt a sense of peace. Her work was done. Now she would wait for the test. The great storm did not arrive with the fury of a blizzard. It came with a deceptive quiet, a sinister stillness that fell over the prairie. The sky, which had been a turbulent gray for weeks, cleared to a brilliant, crystalline blue. The temperature plummeted. It was a dry, piercing cold, a cold that felt ancient and absolute. Then, the freezing rain began. It was not a drizzle, but a steady, relentless downpour of liquid ice. It fell for a full day and a night, coating every surface in a perfect, seamless sheath of glass. The trees in the hollow glittered as if made of crystal, but their beauty was treacherous. Branches, heavy with the impossible weight, began to snap with a sound like pistol shots. The prairie itself became a mirror, a vast, unbroken sheet of ice. The wind returned, no longer howling, but shrieking, a high, thin sound that cut through the air like a blade. It was a storm not of snow, but of pure, solid weight. Inside the cabins of Providence, the mood shifted from anxiety to outright fear. The freezing rain found its way through the tiniest cracks in their shingled roofs. It froze, expanded, and broke the cedar shingles with sharp, cracking sounds. The weight of the ice was a burden the steep roofs were never designed to bear. Snow would slide off, but the ice clung with a malevolent grip, growing thicker with every passing hour. The first roof to fail was Caleb's. A loud groan echoed through the settlement, followed by the splintering crack of a ridgepole giving way. A section of his roof sagged inward, and icy water began to pour into his small cabin, hissing as it hit the hot stove. He and his family evacuated in a panic, scrambling across the treacherous ice to a neighbor's home, their faces masks of terror. Their refuge was not much better. In every cabin, the same drama was unfolding. The immense weight of the ice was forcing the log walls outward. The chinking, frozen solid, was cracking and falling away, opening up new avenues for the predatory cold. Men stood on chairs, desperately trying to brace their groaning roof beams with spare lumber. Women huddled with their children, wrapping them in every blanket they owned, their eyes fixed on the ceilings that threatened to collapse upon them. They burned through their woodpiles at a terrifying rate, but the heat was a flickering candle against a tidal wave of cold. Their homes, their symbols of pride and security, had become traps. The worst of it was in Thomas's cabin. As the master builder, his home was the largest, his roof the most steeply pitched, a testament to his skill. And now, that grand pitch was its undoing. The surface area was immense, and it had collected a staggering tonnage of ice. He could hear the main support beams groaning under the strain, the wood fibers screaming as they were stretched to their breaking point. A fine powder of frost and wood dust sifted down from the ceiling. His wife was praying in a low murmur, her hands clenched around a wooden cross. His children were crying, their fear a palpable thing in the frigid air. He, the man who had built this entire town, was powerless. His knowledge, his experience, his tradition, it had all failed him. He was wrong. Meanwhile, in Ilara's cabin, a different reality was taking shape. The freezing rain had coated her sod roof in the same thick layer of ice, a solid, glistening carapace. The weight was enormous, far greater than any snowfall. But her cabin did not groan. The reinforced frame, which her neighbors had called foolishly overbuilt, accepted the load and distributed it evenly down the thick log walls and into the frozen earth. The structure was as solid as a boulder. Inside, there was a profound and peaceful silence. The thick layers of ice, sod, and bark formed an insulating barrier of incredible efficiency. The wind shrieked outside, but they could barely hear it. The stove burned with a low, steady flame, consuming wood at a placid, economical rate. The air was not just warm, it was a comfortable, even temperature throughout the small room. There were no drafts. No frost bloomed on the interior walls. Sophia was on the floor, playing with a small doll carved from a piece of scrap wood. Lars was reading a worn book by the light of a tallow lamp. Ilara sat in her chair, mending a tear in Lars's coat. She listened to the storm, but it was a distant, abstract thing. The true test was not the storm itself, but the quiet, unwavering integrity of her home. Every element was working as her grandfather had said it would. The weight was held by the frame. The water was stopped by the bark. The cold was defeated by the earth. It worked. The quiet simplicity of that fact filled her not with pride, but with a deep and abiding gratitude. She had listened to the old wisdom, and it had kept her children safe. The sound that finally broke the peace was not the storm, but a frantic, desperate pounding on her door. Lars jumped, and Sophia looked up from her doll, her eyes wide. Ilara put down her sewing, her heart quickening. She moved to the door and lifted the heavy wooden bar. She pulled it open, and a blast of Arctic air swirled into the room. Standing on her doorstep, his face caked in ice and his beard frozen solid, was Thomas. He was a silhouette of desperation against the gray, swirling chaos of the storm. His eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, darted past her into the cabin. He saw the serene, warm interior. He saw her children, safe and calm. He felt the wave of steady, enveloping warmth wash over him, a physical shock after the brutal cold outside. It was a warmth he had not felt in days, a warmth he had thought impossible in this storm. The stark contrast between the world inside her cabin and the one he had just fled was a chasm too wide for his mind to cross. Outside was failure, fear, and the imminent threat of collapse. Inside was peace, warmth, and an unshakable sense of security. The sight before him was an irrefutable, physical testament to his own arrogance. His masterpiece was a collapsing death trap. Her savage's hut was a sanctuary. He stood there, swaying slightly, the shrieking wind tearing at his coat. He looked from the calm children to the gently burning stove, to the dry, solid walls. He saw no frost on the nailheads. He felt no drafts. His gaze traveled upward, to the ceiling, the underside of her bizarre creation. It was solid, silent, and secure. There were no groans, no cracks, no sifting dust of imminent failure. For a long moment, he could not speak. The words of mockery he had thrown at her echoed in his memory, each one a shard of ice in his own throat. A tomb for you and your children. The irony was a physical weight in his chest. His own pride had nearly built a tomb for his. He looked at Ilara, and in her calm, questioning gaze, he found no trace of triumph, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet concern. She did not boast. She did not remind him of his warnings or his laughter. She simply saw a man, a neighbor, freezing on her doorstep in the middle of a deadly storm. She stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come in," she said, her voice soft but clear over the scream of the wind. "You will freeze out there." Thomas stumbled forward, crossing the threshold from his world of failure into hers of quiet success. The warmth enveloped him like a blanket. He let out a shaky breath, the sound of a man who had been holding it in for days. He looked at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from the shock of his realization. He was wrong. Utterly, completely, and dangerously wrong. Ilara closed the door, shutting out the storm. The profound silence of the cabin descended once more. She gestured to a small stool near the stove. "Sit," she said. "I will make you some tea." It was a simple, neighborly act, an extension of grace so profound it left him speechless. He sank onto the stool, the warmth from the stove beginning to thaw his frozen limbs. But he knew it would take much longer for the warmth of her humility to thaw the ice of his pride. After the storm finally broke, a fragile, exhausted sun shone on a world remade in glass. The settlement of Providence was a ruin. Not a single steep-pitched roof had survived unscathed. Most had partially collapsed, and all were leaking, their structures compromised, their shingles shattered. The people emerged from their damaged homes like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking in the harsh light, their faces etched with exhaustion and defeat. The first thing they saw was Thomas's family, huddled in blankets, emerging not from his own ruined cabin, but from Ilara's. Then they saw Ilara's cabin itself. It stood intact. Its low earthen roof was covered in the same thick, sparkling coat of ice as everything else, but it bore the weight with an untroubled solidity. A thin plume of smoke rose calmly from its chimney, a sign of the peaceful warmth within. It was the only home in the entire settlement that looked not just habitable, but comfortable. Word spread quickly, a murmur of awe and disbelief. One by one, and then in small groups, the settlers made their way across the treacherous ground to her cabin. They did not come to mock. They came to see. They stood at a respectful distance, staring at the strange, low structure that had defied the storm that had broken them all. The laughter was gone, replaced by a stunned, humbled silence. Thomas emerged from the cabin, his face grave. He did not need to speak. The fact that he, the master builder, had taken refuge in the very home he had condemned was a more powerful testimony than any words. He met the eyes of his neighbors, and in their faces he saw the same dawning realization that he had experienced. When the ice began to melt and the immediate danger had passed, Thomas approached Ilara again. He found her outside, checking the sod on her roof for any damage. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. He was a proud man, and the words came hard, but he knew they had to be said. "I was wrong," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "My pride. It nearly cost my family their lives. My roof is ruined. My home is filled with ice and water. My family was cold and afraid." He paused, then looked her directly in the eye. "Your family was warm. Your family was safe. I came to warn you that you were building a tomb, but it was I who was building a trap." Ilara listened, her expression calm and unreadable. She simply nodded, accepting his confession without judgment. "I ask you," Thomas continued, his voice dropping to a plea, "teach me, teach us. What you know, it is a wisdom this land requires. We were fools to laugh. Please, show us how you did this." It was the moment of complete surrender, the proud patriarch of the old way humbling himself before the quiet innovator he had scorned. It was the turning point, not just for him, but for the entire community. Ilara did not hesitate. She harbored no resentment, no desire for retribution. She saw only neighbors in need, people who were willing to learn. She nodded. "There is no great secret," she said. "It is just a different way of seeing the winter. Not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a force to be understood." She led Thomas and a gathering group of the other men to the side of her cabin. With a piece of charcoal, she began to draw on a large, flat piece of stripped bark she had saved. She sketched the heavy, interlocking frame. She drew the layers of planks, bark, and sod, explaining the purpose of each. "The strength is in the bones," she said, pointing to the drawing of the frame. "It must be strong enough to hold the heaviest, wettest snow, and the ice, too. You cannot cheat the weight." She then drew the layers of the roof itself. "The pitch is low," she explained, "so the snow stays. The snow is a blanket. A good, thick blanket of snow is better insulation than any wood." "But the water?" Caleb asked, his voice full of genuine curiosity now. "When it melts?" "That is the birch bark," Ilara answered. She picked up a spare piece and showed them its smooth, waterproof texture. "You lay it like this, curled side down, one piece over the next. The water runs in the channels and off the edge. It never touches the wood. It is the roof's dry skin." "And the sod?" another man asked. "The sod is its flesh," she said, her analogy simple and powerful. "It holds the warmth from your fire inside. It keeps the wind from stealing it. It is heavy, yes, but its weight is a good weight. It is the weight of safety." She spoke for over an hour, patiently answering every question. She shared the knowledge her grandfather had given her freely, without any expectation of payment or praise. She explained the importance of cutting the sod in the autumn before the ground froze hard, of choosing the right kind of bark, of sealing every seam with pitch. The men listened, their faces rapt with attention. They were no longer listening to a foolish woman. They were students at the feet of a master. The scorn had transformed into reverence. That spring, as the last of the ice melted and the prairie began to breathe again, the sound of hammers and saws once more filled the air in Providence. But the work was different. The men were not nailing shingles onto steep frames. They were heading into the woods to find fallen birch, and into the prairie to cut sod. Under Ilara's quiet guidance, and with Thomas as her most dedicated and exacting foreman, they began to rebuild. They dismantled their broken roofs, salvaging what timber they could. They laid new, heavy frames. They stripped bark and hauled sod. The landscape of the settlement began to change. The sharp, angular peaks that had defined the town were replaced one by the soft, low-sloping lines of the living roofs. The work was harder and slower than before, but it was done with a new sense of purpose and a deep, abiding respect for the materials and the design. By the time the first snows of the next winter arrived, Providence was transformed. A collection of nearly identical, sod-roofed cabins stood ready, hunkered down into the landscape as if they had grown there. When the cold returned, it found no purchase. The homes were warm, quiet, and secure. The woodpiles lasted twice as long. The fear that had once been a constant companion through the winter months was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. The story of the widow's roof and the ice storm that nearly destroyed Providence traveled through the territory. Trappers, merchants, and new settlers passing through would marvel at the strange, earth-covered homes. They would hear the tale from Thomas himself, who never tired of telling it, always ending with the same humble admission. We thought we knew everything, and she showed us we knew nothing. The design, which became known simply as the Providence roof, was copied and adapted, spreading across the northern plains. It became a quiet testament to a better way of building, a testament born from a crisis, humility, and the sharing of old wisdom. Years later, Elara would sit by her stove, watching her grandchildren play on the floor of the same small, warm cabin. The settlement had grown, but the lesson of that first terrible winter was never forgotten. It was woven into the very fabric of the town, as integral as the logs in their walls and the earth on their roofs. The people of Providence had learned that survival was not about fighting the wildness of the land with rigid pride, but about listening to it with humility. They learned that the most profound wisdom is often quiet, unassuming, and carried in the memory of a grandfather. And that sometimes the strangest, most ridiculed idea can be the one that saves you all.